Welcome, everyone. You are all very welcome to the third session of the ESREA STREAM Network, which is a series of seminars curated and organized by the network conveners, myself, Fadia Daka, and my colleagues and friends, Michelle Alhadef-Jones and Sabine Schmidt-Lauf, with the help and support and collaboration of Monika Stab. Just to help you navigate the acronyms, especially for those of you who joined today for the first time, STREAM Network is a newly found network that the acronym stands for the Spaces, Times and Rhythms of Adult Education and Their Movements, and sits within ESREA, the European Society for Research of Education, the European Society for the Research of Education of Adults. So, as I said, this seminar series, which now is at the third session, focuses on the spaces and times of transitions in the context of adult education. The driving question here is, how do we recalibrate the multiple scales of change in adult education? Last week, we were very fortunate to have Emeritus Professor Arpad Shakolzai kicking us off with a very interesting and thought-provoking tour de force on the conceptual history of the concept of liminality. And this week, we have the pleasure of having with us Elisa Thevenot, who will explore the theme of life course and transition. Before giving her the floor for the presentation, I'll say a few words about our guest. Elisa Thevenot is based in the University of Tübingen in Germany at the Institute for Education and Social Pedagogy. In the past 4 years, she has been an active member of the DFG, which is I hear, very important and highly ranked, nationally funded research training program called Doing Transition, that she will tell us more about in a few minutes. She is mostly interested in biographical learning that sits at the intersection of work, sustainability, and life course. In her PhD, she investigated how work-life trajectories and professional transitions play out in the context of ecological transition. This project in particular was an empirical qualitative study based on practice theory approach. In the field of adult learning, she is particularly interested in non-traditional educational spaces. And in the past year, she's been preparing for a postdoc project on the topic of collective learning within sustainable spaces. And she says she hopes to get funding for a postdoc project about, again, collective learning in sustainable spaces. So this is also a good platform to introduce and present her work. Now I am very happy to give the floor to Elisa. Please take it away and welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much, Fadia, Michelle, Sabine, and Monika for inviting me. And I really enjoyed the past 2 sessions. And I think my contribution today will be a nice complement. And this 45-minute format is hopefully going to give us a little more time than usual to enter my research approach, reflections, past and future projects. So more than my contribution, my talk about transitions is a group work by the research training group called Doing Transitions, in which I was an active member for 4 years. And this is kind of my starting base for looking into transitions. And in the second section, I will further describe my approach to life course, considering the focus of the symposium is transitions in life course. It's going to be a good amount of our time. And then the next 2 sections, I'll try to make my approach more graspable by drawing on my PhD example as a phenomenon and related to rhythm analysis. Thinking transitions in the life course in terms of rhythms, I find very exciting and a fruitful heuristic. So how I understand transitions. Transitions in the life course was kind of a given central topic in my research in my PhD project, financed by Doing Transitions. It's a so-called Graduiertenkolleg that happened over 9 years, and it's still ongoing. It will finish in 2025. And it was initiated and co-directed by Andreas Walter from the Goethe University Frankfurt and Barbara Stauber from the University of Tübingen. And the program is divided in 3 cohorts of approximately 45 PhDs, 14 professors, 3 postdocs, and obviously a broad network of critical friends, fellows, and other types of associates. And the point of departure of Doing Transitions is to provide a new perspective on transitions in the life course, to move away from classically framed ideas behind transition, ideas such as a transition as though a process from A to B, transitions as though involving a change of status, as though having been either successful or unsuccessful. Finally, and not seeing transitions as though a given natural fact. Transitions are unlike the process of physical growth or maturation, which is viewed as natural. The group instead asks how transitions in the life course are shaped, practiced, and performed, and thus understands transitions as being constantly reproduced through performance. And here I'll try to make a link with the presentation of last week by Arpad about liminality. Arpad last week used the metaphor of the door to explain liminality. We heard last week that the door mediates between 2 rooms, between 2 centers, and that the door, one is neither in a space and one doesn't belong to any room, but sees both rooms. The Doing Transitions perspective is interested in how the door looks like, how the door was constructed. Is it a very heavy wooden door? Is it a sliding door? Is it a glass window door so you can see through it, see the other room? Or is it a mystery door where you have no idea what's behind? Is it a door that needs to be opened with the key? Is it a door on top of a staircase and thus harder for some people to physically reach and cross it? Is it a squeaky door making a loud sound that bothers everybody around? We can ask ourselves whether the door is big enough for all of us or whether it is supposed to sort some out. So Doing Transitions asks who and how was the door put there in the first place? Who and how is the door repaired, replaced? When it is broken, when it is old-fashioned, who continues to call it a door? Who ignores there's even a door there? Who intentionally avoids the door? I think you got my point. The idea is that transitions are a central element of life course research. Transitions are, for example, the object of social policies that reinforce the institutionalized life course and affect the life trajectories of individuals. The transitions that were under investigation or are still under investigation by the numerous Doing Transitions researchers are varied. Life course transitions take place across ages, transitions to in childhood, such as Tabea Freude had a PhD project about children that become independent in their mobility, going from school with their parents to going to school without their parents. There's transitions specific to adult life and transitions in older age. Louisa Bischoff looks into the transition into singlehood in older age, which is maybe something different than being single in one's 20s. Transitions are more or less ritualized. Marriage still often comes with numerous rituals, whereas becoming vegetarian doesn't come with any collectively shared rituals that we all know about. And by putting those 2 transitions next to each other, the transition related to marriage and the transition related to vegetarianism, I also want to stress the difference between well-established transitions and newer transitions. Marriage comes with a lot of rituals, but as we remarked, I think it was remarked last week, some ritual practices are disappearing. The significance of marriage as a relevant marking of the life course has weakened. If you ask someone 30 years ago to construct a biography, she might have mentioned the day she got married. Whereas today, other transitions might be considered more relevant, more significant for the construction of one's biography, to make sense of one's trajectory. The status from unmarried to married does not automatically change much in one's life nowadays, except on administrative papers, whereas the fact of becoming vegetarian might come with numerous consequences, changing where one goes shopping, changes in one's health, changing friends with whom you share common interests. Transitions in the life course are also more or less institutionalized. Institutionalized transitions are kindergarten to school, school to university, transition to parental leave, and less institutionalized, such as transition to teenage years and our changing bodies, transition to becoming a parent, transition to adulthood. All these transitions take place in multi-layered settings and cannot be isolated from one another. However, for analytical purposes, the first cohort of researchers in the Doing Transitions research group were advised to focus on one layer, institutional layer, discursive layer, or individual layer. 3 different entries into the analysis of the production and organization of transitions that function as though research axes, let's say. 3 different modes of doing transitions. 3 different performative realities. Some Doing Transition researchers focus on how institutions shape life course transitions, how they play a role in regulating and processing transitions. Institutions mark conditions, times, and duration of transitions. How long does one have to live in a country to become a citizen? Institutions determine access to membership in social categories, being 18 years old and earning the right to vote, or performance of knowledge and skills through the distribution of certifications, diplomas. Andreas Walter, the co-director of the Doing Transitions program, prior to the Graduatenkolleg, has been involved in European projects in comparative analysis of labor markets to understand how different countries, European countries, organize the transition of young adults to the labor market. Other researchers focused on how discourse shapes life course transitions and have asked how are transitions framed and produced by discursive articulation? What are the requirements? In which instances do we distinguish between success and failure? How do we mark risks? Discourses following Foucault and the archaeology of knowledge represent powerful orders of knowledge. These orders are productive because they frame how social phenomena are named in a specific way. Discourses make for structural order, and they are also practical acts of distinction, acts of addressing, acts of evaluation. Imagine the transition to school and the teacher telling the first graders on the first day of school, "You are now big kids." Discursive practices of addressing or evaluating are very powerful in transition. Discourses contribute to normality as a system of self-evidence of what can and cannot be said. It would be weird if the teacher would say, actually it wouldn't be weird because they become the first graders and they become the small kids in the big school, but yeah. I think you got my point. The researcher, maybe an example, the example of Andrea Pauling, for example. She studied the transition to articulating sexual abuse. The aim was to understand how subjects are addressed and co-constituted by powerful social discursive practices, while taking into account and accepting individual room for maneuver. So people start to talk about sexual abuse, maybe due to this historical discourse that gives us words to talk about it. Institutional practices and discursive practices do not necessarily go hand in hand. The state might consider 18-year-olds to be adults, but 18-year-old is probably not addressed. An 18-year-old is probably not addressed as an adult by others. The mismatch between institutions, requirements, and the discursive normality can produce disorientation, border crossing, infringement, and also situational exceptions, passing one's high school diploma at 15 instead of 18. Finally, some researchers focus on how subjects shape life force transitions. This perspective doesn't presuppose that transitions are individual experiences. They are very much intersubjective, co-produced, shared, dependent, conditioned, constrained. In other words, transitions are processes individuals experience and are subject to. And when transitions are institutionally prescribed, they can be adopted, rejected, or modified against the backdrop of biographical patterns. In some countries, adults can resist from voting, although they are adults and they might have a biographical story to tell us about how they came to not vote. A doing transitions approach enables to view and analyze transitions beyond changes in social states. And here I quote from Doing Transitions book. Transitions refer to movements into new social situations and positions. Transitions express classifications, differentiating and addressing, fulfill the function of social allocation, distribute social goods, prestige, attention, access, and thus become socially momentous in having social consequences and affecting individuals' life trajectories. To generate new ideas in the second phase of the program, the research group changed framework 90 degrees, I would say, by focusing on relations. Instead of distinguishing between institutional, discursive, and subject, the idea is to look into distinct relations, interpersonal relations, temporal relations, and material relations. So interpersonal relation is the emphasis that this idea of linked lives. Transitions are actively negotiated with other actors, the importance of significant others with whom lives are intertwined and transitions are interlinked. For example, getting a divorce has an effect on the partners, but it also has a bigger effect on the lives of the children who are subject to their parents' divorce, living between two homes, having everything double, doing Christmas twice for the rest of one's life. There is an increased probability of falling into a precarious situation due to the divorce of the parents. The transition to being an adult is not only about feeling one is an adult, but also considering others or others considering you to be an adult. Material relations. This perspective puts an emphasis on the importance of materialities in transition. Objects, artifacts, architectures, spatial arrangements. Much can be analyzed about how a transition is shaped through those elements. In Germany, on the first day of school, children need to have a Schultüte. It's like a school goodie bag. And just by looking at this object, many processes can be analyzed. You can look at the difference between Schultüte 50 years ago and nowadays, or you can look into inequalities, how inequalities are marked and reproduced through this object. Some have big Schultüte, some have small Schultüte that are empty or full, and some buy it at the supermarket, and others have a Schultüte that was made by someone at home, homemade Schultüte. Like objects, spaces are not absolute entities, but constantly reproduced fabrics of social practices. So this means rather than a container, spaces are not neutral protective shells that merely react, but also something human construct. looking into material relations means reflecting about the social power relations that inevitably come into view and are not external to the design spaces. And an example is Michel Foucault's demonstration of the panopticon prison as a space with a lot of power, the architecture. So materials are strongly entangled in the reproduction of social inequalities and explain also how transitions are made. Finally, temporal relations. This is probably obvious to all of us interested in rhythms. The probable ways to go about understanding temporal relations are numerous. During transitions has been most interested in chrononorms. The fact that transitions usually take place within a certain time frame. It is commonly understood that retiring happens at 65, that studying at the university takes approximately 5 years, and whatever infringes those chrononorms, usually tied to biological age, can have more or less severe consequences. Variations in timing, whether a transition occurs early on time or late, has consequences for the life course and the relationship to others' lives. So you hopefully know how doing transitions is currently being used as a fruitful heuristic now for numerous empirical research. And it has generated many exciting ideas. And I will mention 2 of them, which I find most interesting and which have become relevant for my research. One of which is an Emmy Noether group now. It's also a kind of funding in Germany that is very good to have. And the group is called Linking Ages. And this was initiated by several members of Doing Transitions and has been turned into an actual research group. So if we go back to one of the first comments I made about different transitions, I said that we make transitions across ages. However, when it comes to researching a transition in the life course, we tend to position the transition as pertaining to childhood studies, adult education, or gerontology. Age tends to stand unbothered as a master social category. And I have one striking example in educational science. Researchers that deal with school-related topics and thus more or less directly related to children do not necessarily say they are children education researchers. And those that have an interest for adults, however, because it is not the norm, tend to add adult in front of education. I'm an adult education researcher. And although many of us agree to the notion of lifelong learning, we still tend to produce results about adults and mark a difference with children learning. However, for certain transitions, this is the idea behind linking ages. It is very interesting to look across ages to understand how transitions are similarly or differently experienced. So let's imagine I interview a 12-year-old, a 25-year-old, and a 90-year-old, and ask them to narrate their transition to veganism. The comparison between the interviews will make emerge the differentiated obstacles, resistance, opportunities related to this transition. The 12-year-old might make parents a relevant factor for their successful or unsuccessful transition. The 90-year-old might make the retirement home a relevant factor for their successful or unsuccessful transition. And the 25-year-old might be expected to be in a phase of transformation anyways, a phase when tastes are supposed to change. Making this kind of age comparisons directs our gaze to other corners of the phenomenon of transitioning to veganism. Some usually taken for granted social conditions and inequalities emerge that are highly relevant and to successfully pass this transition or not. Another interesting idea by the Linking Ages group is a methodological contribution. They suggest interpreting interview passages without knowing the age of the interviewee. So researchers have to rely on other categories, science stripped of biological age symbols, a method that makes visible other types of struggles, other learnings, sometimes cross-generational, and sometimes we come up with a lot of surprises. Especially in the context of the ecological transition, we can ask whether it is always relevant to make generational distinctions, to argue in terms of what does marking general difference, present versus future generation, produce for our understanding of the ecological transition. Another branch of doing transitions, and that's another idea, is based on doing difference. And before I do that, I also need to mention something important about doing transitions, which is the word doing in front of transition. What is meant by doing relates to West and Zimmerman's articles about doing gender and about doing difference, which was also taken by Stefan Hirschauer for the Germans in the audience. Doing gender, they say, is a routine, methodical, and recurring accomplishment embedded in everyday interaction. This means it is individuals who perform, who do transitions, yet it is carried out in the presence of others and thus an ongoing interactional accomplishment. This prefix in front of transitions has many consequences, one of which is that transitions are not a neutral social phenomena, but a component of powerful social orders and their reproduction. In other words, by doing transition, differences become salient. Indeed, transitions refer to the crossing of boundaries between social states, between phases of life, between social positions, between institutional roles. Transitions contribute to demarcation. Transitioning to school is a reminder between being a small kid and a big kid. Transitioning to veganism implies there are those that are vegan and those that are not. And if we go back to the door to finish this section on the metaphor I started with, there are two spaces, two centers in the first place, because there is a door in the middle. How I understand life course. To understand the organization and experience of the whole life course, transitions are central. Transitions give a structure to the life course. This becomes clear if we think of the standardized sequence of life stages that constitute our life courses. There is a shared understanding that we go from school, a phase in life that usually evokes ideas of preparation, to work in the so-called active phase of life, to retirement, the phase of life that evokes ideas of resting. For Martin Kohli, this institutionalization of the life course is one of the major socialization programs of our times, a structure ensured and enforced by social institutions such as work, family, or retirement, and their respective policies and organizations. And individuals gain meaning, orientation, and identity through their location in the life course. And from the perspective of biographical research, we have come to understand that giving an account of one's life course, constructing a biography by making sense of the different events that have marked our life and how they hang together, as well as articulating how individual, organizational, and societal processes intertwine, is a very rich exercise for research, as well as a suitable training approach for learning. And I will pass on descriptions of biographical research and biographical learning, assuming most of you are familiar with it already. What I'd like to stress in this section is, in an inverted way, that to understand life course transitions, it has become central to consider the rest of the life course and its context. As I have explained in the first section, if transitions are constantly being performed, it means they are experienced individually and highly dependent on situated context. For example, becoming a parent nowadays doesn't mean the same thing as becoming a parent 50 years ago. Whatever our grandparents can teach us about becoming parents might be inappropriate and difficult to put in practice, considering the current context. Instead, it can make more sense to lay down one's biography, relate to contemporary societal processes, relate to current institutional framings, reflect one's own trajectory, such as making sense of how other significant transitions were dealt with in the past, understand which resources are at stake, can and cannot be mobilized, and evaluate one's own room of maneuver, linked to the room of maneuver of the significant partner, to navigate the transition to becoming a good parent. Would also make sense if we started to exercise giving a biography, maybe, not for everybody. The changing meaning of transitions in the life course is especially apparent in times of great social, economic, and political change. And then changing environments come to disrupt or undermine life as it was understood. Now I'm going to pass on the work of Glen Elder, who is one of the initiators, one could say, of life course research. The book Children of the Great Depression is the result of a visit to the Berkeley Institute. Glen Elder in the 70s took a sabbatical year, went to Berkeley Institute, to this institute, and discovered a data archive that was launched during the late 1920s by Jean Walker Macfarlane, a clinical psychologist interested in child welfare. Macfarlane's research program went on over 4 decades. It was a pioneering longitudinal project that followed the lives of 420 members born between 1885 to 1908 in Europe and America. Men and women that eventually settled in Berkeley, where they married and raised their families. Individuals who, for the most part, immigrated from Europe or the East Coast or Midwest and were seeking a better life. The data included qualitative life records, open-ended interviews, observations, and interview notes that gave a relatively full picture of 4 generations. Glen Elder found this collection of life histories most interesting because they provide a richly contextualized perspective about how transitions, turning points, and pathways were experienced. In 2021, with the help of Rick Setterson and Lisa Pierce, the book Living on the Edge came out and shed new light on these life trajectories. It shows how history has an imprint on human lives for generations after. It also accounts for the rapid social change and uncertainty that already defined the lives of Americans born at the turn of the 20th century. Already back then, members of this generation found that social change was unsettling the very roots of our being. The American writer Walter Lippmann is quoted for saying that change is not an illusion, but a fact. We do actually move toward novelty. There is invention, and what has never been is created each day. And that we have changed our environment more quickly than we know how to change ourselves. The social change in retrospect can be understood as historical events, economic depression, war times. The argument is that feeling social change, feeling the rapidity at which things are changing around us, is not specific to our contemporary lives. For those that have seen the film Oppenheimer, which might win the Oscars next week, I find this dimension of dealing with uncertainty well documented. Living in a world where allies become enemies from one day to the next, where who you can trust is interpreted differently with time, and the main character himself, Oppenheimer, not really knowing if he should actually embrace communist ideas or subscribe to Russian ideas. In the book Living on the Edge, to come back, living on the edge of change, one could say, the lives of Berkeleyan are pieced together to give an intimate first-hand view of a group of individuals and families who experienced and talked about the distinctive historical times and places that had given shape and meaning to their lives. Individual lives and events were made visible, but also patterns about how radical ups and downs were experienced, from their social origin, through their education, marriage, childbearing, and employment, and this across historical events that were at the time not historical, they were just being lived. Prosperous 20s of then the Great Depression of 1930s, World War II, and then a long post-era, post-war prosperity. This idea that context is important to understand life course transition was a central part of my PhD research. In the past 4 years, my focus was on work-life trajectories in the context of the ecological transition. The initial assumption was that our contemporary Western context, and more specifically the ever-pressing environmental crisis and ever-present collective ecological transition imaginary, is changing the way we live, what we aspire to, how we understand work and career, why we work, how we work, and how we understand the relation between work and the rest of our lives. And to go about describing these changes, I focus on the work trajectories of individuals that have conducted a career transition to a sustainability-related job. Making transitions into an object of research gives access to life course narratives that include a past trajectory, liminality, and a projected future. And the focus on transitions made by empirical researchers can be seen as a tool to make visible social processes of change and reproduction that take place throughout the life course. So professional transitions in the context of the ecological transition is a major topic at a policy level. Policymakers are wondering whether the ecological transition will create or destroy jobs. In theory, the ecological transition could create massive amounts of useful jobs and make people happy, allow us to meet our climate targets. From an educational perspective, this means coming up with ideas about how to convert and transform skills. People manufacturing cars might switch to working on electrical vehicles. Farmers might switch from chemical treatment to natural alternatives. And this shift comes with completely new work arrangements, the acquisition of different knowledge, sometimes contradictory knowledge, contradictory values. And we know now with the strikes of the past months in Europe, the kind of retaliation that can be produced. Besides training geared towards transforming skills and the adjustment of practices at work, the ecological transition is also a topic in lifelong learning discourses, where it's implied that individuals should continue learning if they want to cope with the fast-paced societal change and future uncertainties. Empowering citizens in all paths of life to anticipate and cope with changing circumstances tends to feed the narrative that individuals are at the same time free, obliged, and responsible for making the correct choices and decisions regarding their own private and professional lives. Accordingly, in the context of the ecological transition, individuals are more than ever urged to play their part by changing personal consumption habits and other unsustainable practices for the good of the collective, to become eco-citizens. From these indirect societal expectations, individuals are given somehow room for maneuver to decide for themselves, to decide, among other things, how to combine contradictory agendas, looking after oneself, carving customized path in life, in line with fast-paced changing expectations, staying attractive for the job market. But on the other hand, looking after the planet and the collective and taking somewhat individual responsibility by making individual transformations and compromises for the sake of the environmental crisis. In other words, whether we want it or not, we are supposed to individually make sense, calibrate opposing agendas, calibrate not only everyday practices, because implicitly what transpires in ecological transition discourse is the need for individuals to reflect and adjust mid and long-term aspirations and values. In other words, we're expected to revise not only the standards that guide our daily lives, but also the standards that enable us to imagine our future, to more or less plan and design our life course over the long term. People in their 20s are probably not dreaming of going around the world when they retire because of travel. Maybe travel will have a totally different significance in 30 years from now, 40 years from now. And adapting to the ecological transition means learning to revisit one's life trajectory, future options, renegotiating what it means to have a good life, to have succeeded in one's career, to have done something purposeful in life. It is now frequent and accepted to express doubts about the notion of conventional, successful professional career. I already mentioned that before. So I really like the following example to illustrate my point. In Germany, an important number of teachers are organized and have come together as a group called Teachers for Future. They are quite active. They organized, for example, a conference in collaboration with the University of Mainz called Being a Teacher in the Climate Crisis, How Existential Crises Change Our Profession. Rather than the school as an institution reflecting and organizing such an event, it is here individuals with similar interests and values who are concerned about their profession, that are expressing doubts about the institution they represent. This type of collective and those events might not have been appropriate 10 years ago. But today, however, there is more or less consensus that what they're doing is good, even from the perspective of the institution. The pictures you see on this slide were taken for a press article that was interested in those individuals that make impressive career changes. These kinds of life trajectories make for good stories and are quite visible in the media. These kinds of life trajectories make for, I'm repeating, especially those transitions that move from a so-called intellectual work to a more hands-on work and a full change in lifestyle. The pictures evoke this image of living the good life. Upon this context, professional transitions take on new significances in this, transitioning from a banking career to growing vegetables rather than a downshifting move and much social disapproval has become quite trendy. Doing sustainable development is fashionable, and making a professional transition in this context is positively sanctioned, even if it generally means less pay, less stability, fewer established structures that could give an impression of security on the job. So professional transitions in this context can be seen as a form of positive deviance. More than within specific professional fields, there is a global phenomenon to be observed about our changing relationship to work. You might recall the Great Resignation, or Big Quit, which is this mass exodus of employees voluntarily leaving their jobs. And there was kind of It was highly mediatized on TikTok, the social media platform, and it made it possible to testify for the momentum that was going on. Job leavers were using the app to announce publicly that they were leaving their jobs. Reading through the comments, it sounded like a normal and cool thing to do. And what I find interesting is not necessarily the acts of quitting, but the collection of all those narratives about quitting that somehow give the impression that something big about our relationship to work is happening. These narrations probably made it easier for others to dare exit and to see it as a positive experience. In other words, these narrations on TikTok of others served as a catalyzer for others' transitions, probably. So why aren't we all doing it? Quitting many of our unsustainable practices, exiting organizations, institutions we don't agree with. Why aren't we going more green if everybody agrees that that's the way to go? The classical comment that surfaces when I present this research project is that it's a question of having enough financial backup, that questioning one's practices or the purpose of one's job is a luxury that only those that don't really need to work can afford to do. However, as sustainability is becoming more mainstream, more common in some areas of life at least, and slowly traversing classes to a certain point, it makes sense to look at how sustainability and work trajectories are related by taking new research angles. How do these two transitions are linked? The professional transition and the ecological transition. If I understood Stanley Blue yesterday from the parallel session, I might say that it is the link between professional transition and the ecological transition that makes up a particular temporality. That's where I want to bring in rhythms. I usually say that rhythm analysis is for me a heuristic tool and methodological support. The first time I heard about rhythm analysis was because of my practice theory reading and the text of Stanley Blue, an article from 2019. And I've been mostly influenced by practice theory in the past years. You might have heard it in my choice of words and the way I ontologize the social. And thinking in terms of rhythms for the past year and a half has been fruitful. It's a way to enter complexity of a phenomenon, a way to dissect elements that could be perceived as distant, far-fetched, and yet with rhythms, a solution to bring them into conversation, bring them together. And yesterday, in his presentation, Stanley, drawing on Henri Lefebvre, said rhythm analysis can be seen as a new science. Yeah, I can't. I'll need to think more about that still. Whatever it is, rhythms for me make a lot of sense because I look at how people individually navigate, cope with so many different topics in their lives that take place simultaneously and yet are quite complex to piece together. How can we calibrate life course rhythms and ecological transition rhythms? The life course we can consider to be an institutional rhythm because we have this shared collective understanding that individuals move from one stage of life to the next in the right temporal order. And I said that before. The work stage of life comes with a different set of rhythms, and the transition to retirement also comes with the different types of rhythms. Every time we go, well, not every time, when we go from work to retirement, we're just guided by other rhythms. When we zoom in those phases of life, such as the active life, the adult, we discover that there's much disruption. Expected disruption, such as the birth of a child, and unexpected disruption, such as the pandemic. Now we can ask ourselves whether the ecological transition also comes to disrupt our life course rhythms. Some discourses implicitly suggest the ecological transition is a strong rhythm that we have urgently learned to integrate in our everyday lives, that comes to modify our consumption habits, our mobility habits, our living habits, our future aspirations, and yet we are left to decide for ourselves when to move with the ecological transition and when to prioritize other things. I brought a quote, but I don't have much time, so I'm just going to read the middle part, and it's in French because I knew we had a few French people in the audience, but I'll read it in English in the middle. So it changed me a lot. And as a result, I think I discovered life at that moment. And for me, I couldn't go on like that anymore. I couldn't be happy in my job as a banker. I couldn't be happy in my family life, with my consumption, with my car, with all that. I absolutely had to leave the bank because it was no longer possible. As a result, market gardening, growing vegetable quickly became an obvious choice. So does the ecological transition collide with our life course? Or is the ecological transition so slow, ubiquitous, ongoing, never-ending, linear, yet not experienced as something significant in the life course because hardly comparable to the lifespan? That's why we often talk about generations. Oh, it's something for the next generation, as though a knowledge we carry that is so obvious, and we forget how it is co-shaping our life experiences. Doing more for the environment in many areas of our lives is something we have to negotiate personally. And to conclude, I thought I would stress the three challenges that make it so difficult for us to calibrate our lives with the ecological transition. Challenges that are very much related to each other. The challenge of right timing. Some people might decide that they will start eating less meat on the 1st of January, or that they will eat meat only once a week. Policies are being taken about what type of vehicles will be able to circulate 10 years from now. And we vehicle consumers are expected to plan and adapt our mobility accordingly. The right timing is challenging because it implies adaptation, compromise, and for some, it is about kairos, seeing the timing of one's transition as a window of opportunity, taking advantage of the transition to the ecological transition. A good example is to look at how organizations use ecological transition discourses for marketing purposes. They market now. 30 years ago, they didn't do any greenwashing, but now somehow they're taking advantage of it, and they know they need to do it. It's timed, yeah. Transitioning further with the ecological transition also comes implicitly with a sense of irreversibility. The transition might be for good. Reversing course is not expected. You probably know of people that went vegan from one day to the next, but then reversed course. It was too drastic, too early, spontaneous, not well planned. The timing was not right after all. In these cases, there is a sense of having been unsuccessful, and experiencing an unsuccessful situation is not something many of us like to do. It is one of many risks that accompanies our transition to more sustainability. Finally, transitioning too fast for the sake of the environment can produce intolerability. Transitioning to veganism 40 years ago was most often interpreted as radical, categorized as a hippie act, although the person might have nothing to do with hippies. And vice versa, eating meat twice a day nowadays is also needy of explanation. Resisting the ecological transition in some circles has also become intolerable. So we're always trying to be in sync with the ecological transition rhythm. That's the question. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Elisa. This was a great, rich, and super well structured presentation, and I'm eager to open up the floor for questions and comments.